So welcome everyone to July's Discovery Series. I'm very excited to welcome our speaker today. Before I introduce the speaker though, I do want to call your attention to the whiteboards here. So one of the most important parts of the Discovery Series is having the chance to ask questions and dig deeper into something that really sparks our curiosity. So this is a seminar series where we bring in speakers doing cutting edge research in a way that's accessible for academics, but also people that have no experience in research. And so sometimes we have to dig deeper because this is a 10,000 foot view. So please use your phone, or if you have a computer, or for people viewing online, you can use the chat in Zoom or Mentimeter to enter your questions. And you can bump other people's questions up. If somebody puts a question in that you want asked, then upvote that, so then it's more likely to be posed to the speaker. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tracey Shors. Dr. Shors is a distinguished professor in behavior and systems neuroscience in the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University. She is also a member of the Center for Collaborative Neuroscience. She has published over 150 scientific articles in very high impact journals, including Nature, Science, Nature Neuroscience, and many others. Her work is truly translational from very basic discovery, the first work showing neurogenesis with formation of memories, all the way to clinical trials, which is going to be the focus of today and really has been the focus of her work over the last decade. So it's really an honor to have Dr. Shors join us today. She published her book, her popular book entitled Everyday Trauma. So her topic today is Everyday Trauma, Learning to Forget. Make sure you don't flip that around. Don't forget to learn. Dr. Shors coined the term everyday trauma in that our experiences that we have, we can play over and over in our brain, and it kind of magnifies. It's like a force multiplier of traumas that we experience in our life. And she's going to show us ways to mitigate that and how to avoid that multiplication of that trauma that we have experienced. And so without wasting any additional time, I will hand it off to Dr. Shors.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you everyone for inviting me and coming here today in the middle of the summer to hear about trauma. I promise it won't be too traumatic. But obviously, to talk about trauma, I have to dive into it just a tad before we get to the more positive aspects of forgetting it. So the title of my talk is Everyday Trauma. It's also the title of my book. And I know that people have a difficult association with the word trauma sometimes. They think, oh, I haven't had any trauma. That's only for people who have gone to war or people who have had physical abuse, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth of the matter is almost everybody has some type of trauma. There was a study headed up by Kessler et al. In 2017. They went around the world and asked people about things that had happened to them in their lives. And they discovered that over 70% of people reported having some type of trauma in their lifetime. And, typically those traumatic experiences were associated with war and conflict. Again, one of the ones that we typically associate with trauma. Natural disasters, earthquakes, tornadoes, et cetera, et cetera. Car accidents, of course, are very common. School shootings, unfortunately, have gotten more and more common. Sexual violence, very common, particularly amongst women, where 1 in 3 women will experience some type of sexual physical violence in their lifetime. So those are the types of traumas that people usually, or the type of experiences that people usually associate with trauma. And I want to kind of draw attention to other types of traumatic experiences that are a little bit different because they don't necessarily happen just in one event or one day. They maybe go on and on and on every day. So that would be like chronic disease, people who have cancer, dementia, different types of diseases that are just chronic. Poverty, obviously, is an everyday type of trauma. Homelessness, caretaking, taking care of people who have these illnesses, discrimination, gender discrimination, race discrimination can be quite traumatic. And then, of course, all of us in the world lived through a very traumatic experience, which was the global pandemic. And this was quite unusual in a way to have a traumatic event that affected almost everybody in the world. So I want to kind of draw a distinction between these two types. One of the types of traumas is these short, acute experiences that we remember. You remember like the time, the day it happened, and then you maybe think about that event every day. It comes back to you, you have a reminder, something kind of triggers you. Like, oh yeah, that's what happened that day, and you kind of relive it. And that can become an everyday trauma. And then, of course, there are these other ones that are just chronic, and they're everyday. And those two traumas, two types of trauma kind of overlap, but they also have kind of different systems in the brain and the body that mediate them. So I like to kind of define it, to start off, as expected and unexpected traumas in life that persist as thoughts and memories in our brain, along with the feelings in our body. So how can we think about this? So today I want to focus primarily on the thoughts that we have about what's happened to us in our lives, and how those thoughts generate feelings in our body. So if you have a thought of something bad or reminds you of something bad, you maybe have a bad feeling in your stomach, maybe your heart races, etc. So those are the feelings. And those are all mediated by these memories. Obviously the memories are in our brain, are constructed in our brain, or created in our brain, but then they're tied to these responses in our body, which create the feeling. And when bad things happen to us, it seems like it all happens at once. Something bad happens, you have a thought, a feeling, a memory. But in reality, those experiences are discrete. It takes time to travel from the brain to around the brain to different parts of your body. And we can start to kind of dissect those pathways. And that's primarily what I want to focus on today. In particular, I want to focus on a type of thought. They're called ruminative thoughts, or ruminations. So to ruminate means to do something over and over and over again. It actually comes from the word to chew, like a cow chewing on its cud over and over and over again after all the nutrients have been taken out of it. And so you can think of ruminative thoughts kind of that way. They're thoughts that you have. You've already gotten all the information out of them that's going to help you, but you still keep going back. I want to go back and think about that again and again and again, right? They're repetitive. They're a form of memory because they're repetitive. You just keep doing them over and over again. They're like a habit. They're always autobiographical, so they're always about yourself, something about your life that you're thinking about. They're usually negative. They don't have to be, but they're usually negative. They're often about the past. And I like to think of them as memories laced with mood, because they always have a kind of mood attached to them, or for the most part they do. Some kind of guilt, regret. There's brooding. They call them brooding ruminations. There's depressive ruminations. They're usually like, oh, I wish that hadn't happened. If that hadn't happened, then this wouldn't have happened. And if I hadn't done that, or if I hadn't gone to this place, and so there's a lot of regret. And in fact, ruminative thoughts, ruminations, are highly associated with symptoms of depression and other, symptoms of mood disorders. So anyway, I like to think of them as memories laced with mood. So ruminative thoughts are highly associated with everyday stress, trauma, depression, and anxiety. So you might think, oh, I have these ruminative thoughts. It doesn't really matter as long as the rest of my life is okay. But it turns out that's not really the case. If you ask people about their ruminative thoughts, they also often say that they're having all these other symptoms as well. So they're ruminating, but they're also anxious, they're also depressed, they're also thinking about traumas from the past. So this is one study that we did we asked, a bunch of people about these different symptoms. And you could see here, I think you could, can you see my, oh wait. Thought I had a mouse. Oh, here it is. Okay, cool. That's okay. Yeah, so up here on the left top graph, left top corner, you see the correlation between depressive symptoms, so these are depressive symptoms that people have, and the number of ruminations that they report. And so if someone's having a lot of ruminative thoughts, they're also saying, I feel depressed, sad, don't feel motivated, etc. Similarly with anxiety, you see a strong correlation between anxiety and ruminative thoughts. These same people are saying, oh, I also feel anxious about the future, and I'm ruminating. At the bottom left hand, you see a perceived stress is correlated highly also with these ruminative thoughts. Now, perceived stress is more, how stressed are you feeling now, like today, in your everyday life? How stressed out are you is the term that most people probably think of. So people who are stressed out, they also say that they're ruminating more. And then finally, trauma-related thoughts. So trauma-related thoughts are thoughts that are specifically about a trauma, something bad that's happened to you in your life that you keep reminiscing about or going over. And so they're also highly correlated. So again, it's not that ruminations are just out there on their own causing trouble. They're also associated with all these other phenomena that are problematic for people. So we did a factor analysis to look at this. And without kind of going into the details, we looked to see how predictive these various symptoms were of mental health. We created a primary factor of mental health and then looked to see like how much does each of these types of symptoms contribute to overall mental health. And what we found was that these ruminative thoughts, measured by the ruminative response scale, accounted for like 94% of the variance in this factor, meaning that not only are ruminations bad and they're associated with all these other symptoms that we have, but they might even be like a proxy, proxy for mental health. That if you could somehow control these ruminations or do them less, that some of these other symptoms might fall away as well. Now, so ruminations are bad, obviously, and you can kind of see that from these data and other data that's out there. But there's another problem with ruminations, and this kind of gets back to the memory part that I showed earlier. You have thoughts that generate these feelings, and then you have these memories that kind of keep the feelings coming back over and over again because you keep thinking about them. So one thing we know about memories is that every time you bring back a memory from the past, obviously, you make another memory. So if I have a memory now of, say, my uncle, nothing bad, I loved my uncle, he was super great. But if I think about him now in this context, I've made another memory of my uncle because I brought him back into this context with you today. He's not here with you, but it's just another representation. It's another memory trace in my brain. And again, that's a benign example, but you can imagine if you have a traumatic memory and you keep bringing it back over and over and over again, you're making more and more and more of these memory traces. And, suffice to say, that's changing your brain because memories are in your brain and they're real, they're structural changes that happen, and so making more and more of them might make it that much more difficult to forget. Okay, so can we learn to ruminate less? If ruminations really are kind of the key or a key aspect of mental health, can we ruminate less, and then what else would that do? Would it else help other things as well? So first I want to tell you about a program that I developed over the last, decade and a half or so that does seem to help with ruminations. I didn't develop it specifically for this purpose. It was more translational idea that I had. I'll talk about that in a little while. But for whatever reason, this program really helps with ruminations. And so I'm going to tell you about it first. The program is called Map Train My Brain. So MAP stands for mental and physical. So the mental part of MAP training is focused attention meditation. And you know, a lot of times when people think about meditation, they think it's about relaxing or going off into nirvana or some other state of being. And I don't really think that that's the case for the most part. Meditation is hard. It's really difficult to do. I think of it more as a form of learning because you're learning who you are. You know, when I first meditated, I had never meditated before and I wasn't even that interested in it. And I was thinking of trying to find something that would be effortful to do to help train the brain for this purpose. And someone suggested it, I went and did it, and I was like, oh my gosh, you know, here I am a neuroscientist, I've been studying the brain for 30 years or so by then, and I've never listened to my own brain alone. Like I've never just sat and listened to the thoughts that it generates, the feelings that I have, what happens when it gets bored, what happens when it can't pay attention. You know, I'd never really looked at it from the outside. I'd always experienced it as, you know, my brain doing what I do. So I think of meditation as a way of learning who you are, you know, and that's important, right? You want to learn who you are. If you want to make any kind of change, obviously you need to learn who you are. So I think of it as a form of learning, and that's why I think it's so powerful. When we do focus attention meditation in practice, it's just focusing your attention on your breath. So we sit in complete silence, there's no talking, there's no guidance, it's just learning to be alone with your own brain. And counting the breath one after another gets really difficult because you learn, like, oh, I'm supposed to pay attention, then your mind starts to wander off, you think about what you're gonna have for dinner, how you really don't like to meditate, how you'd rather watch TV, whatever, and then you remember, oh, I was supposed to pay attention. So you forgot, you remember, you learn, forget, remember, learn, forget, remember, just over and over and over, right? And that's the skill. You know, people think, well, it's about learning to be calm or happy. No, you're learning to pay attention. Pay attention to this moment, because this is the only moment that exists. It's the only one. Past doesn't exist anymore. We haven't gotten to the future. This is the moment. And so, we know that intellectually, but living that is, you know, difficult. So you have to have skills. You have to have skills that help you do that. I think the other thing you learn during this type of meditation is you learn that thoughts are transient. You know, there are these electrophysiological impulses. We don't even really know what they are. We don't really know how thoughts are generated in our brain for real. But we know that they are transient. They come and they go. And so one of the other things that you learn when you're meditating is that, yeah, they're just coming and going all the time. And you don't have to get so attached to them. You know, because sometimes you have a thought and you think, oh, it's so important. Well, it's just not. It'll be gone soon and you'll be on to another one. And the final important thing, I think, is you learn to see things as they are. Because again, our brain is kind of set up to kind of help us or make us see things that aren't true. And what meditation does is help you see things as they are in this moment, now. And you know, again, these are all skills that are great to have when you're sitting on a cushion counting your breath, but they're also skills you can take into your life. And so if you're feeling distracted, anxious, you know, ruminating, et cetera, whatever, you can have a skill to bring yourself back to this moment. So one of the things that's important, and I'll make this clear later on in the talk, but what I really wanted from this part of the training was that learning occurs, that learning occurred in everyone all the time when they're doing this, that the learning is new, right? Because for learning to really affect our brain, it needs to be new. You know, you have to learn something new, and it has to be effortful. I know everybody wants a simple fix, you know, something you can take a pill or stimulate here, there, and everywhere, but things that matter, things that really change our brain, they take effort. And I think, and most people do who've ever meditated, it's effortful, right? Meditation it takes some effort. So I think it meets all these criteria. Okay, so that's the mental part. Then the physical part is aerobic exercise. So aerobic means oxygen. So it means you're getting oxygen to your brain. We know that the brain uses like 25% of the oxygen we breathe. So of the oxygen that we take in, almost a quarter of it goes to our brain. That's phenomenal, because there's only like, brain is like 2 or 3% of our body weight. So the brain needs lots of oxygen. The neurons need energy to fire and do all the stuff that we do. Think, learn, remember, right? Just getting here to this talk today. I mean, all this stuff takes a lot of brain energy, and we get that from oxygen. So the best way to get oxygen to your brain is through aerobic exercise, meaning getting your heart rate up, because when your heart beats faster, you get more blood to your brain, and then that's going to do all the things, the wonderful things really that exercise does to the brain. So in this particular program, we use aerobic exercise. We usually estimate it at over 60% of your maximum. So it's 220 minus your age times 0.6. And so for most people, that's above 100 beats per minute. Well, above 100 beats per minute. For younger people, younger adults, maybe over 120. So it's not a brisk walk. Sometimes people ask me, can I go take a walk? Yeah, you can take a walk, but that's not aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise, you really have to get your heart rate up. You'll probably be sweating. If you don't like to exercise, you might be uncomfortable, but that's what you need to do. It's not something you can kind of shortcut. You really have to get your heart rate up. Okay, so this program is 1 hour. Each session is 1 hour long. It's 20 minutes of sitting meditation, followed by 10 minutes of slow walking meditation. Slow walking meditation is very similar to sitting. It's just that you're walking. And instead of focusing your attention on your breath, we focus our attention on our feet. And so you just walk super slow in a circle. Kind of every time your attention wanders around, bring it back to your feet. It's kind of a good way to get from sitting to walking, because then the last part is the aerobic exercise. So then people in this program do 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. And that can be done any way. We've done studies with people running on treadmills, spinning. I have like a aerobics kind of dance class that I also do for some studies. It doesn't really matter, as long as your heart rate is up for about 30 minutes. And that's it. It's, like I said, it's 1 hour. Okay, so does this training with this particular program, does it help with everyday trauma? So I want to tell you about a few studies. One of the first studies that we did was with women who were homeless. This is in New Jersey. There's a center, it's called the Center for Great Expectations, and it's an amazing place. They take women who are homeless and are young mothers. So a lot of these women have either lost their children because they were homeless, or they had their children out on the streets with them. Most of them are infants and toddlers. They also have a lot of trauma, as you can imagine. Some of them have addiction problems as well. There's a woman up here on the right, her name is Peg Wright, and she runs the center. She's an amazing person. She has these 2 big houses, and these women come to live in these houses for a year. Believe it or not, there's like a waiting list to get into this place, because it is so phenomenal. And they provide lots of care. The best thing about it is that they reunite the mothers with their children. So these women are not only learning how to be drug-free and off the streets, et cetera, but they're also learning how to be mothers. And for the most part, they didn't have very good mothers themselves, right? So this is kind of a generational thing of trauma in this group of people, just lots of trauma. And so Peg's idea is break the cycle, break the cycle of trauma. So we provided this program at the center for these women, and we found a pretty striking change. You can see this is what I show here is depression. So on the left, you can see depression was decreased by almost a half. Anxiety also went down by nearly a half. They have a lot of symptoms, particularly anxiety. We also looked at VO2, so we looked at oxygen consumption. Oxygen consumption is the biggest cause of mortality, meaning the higher your VO2, your oxygen you consume, the less likely you are going to die. So you want to have a good oxygen consumption. These women obviously were in very poor health, having lived on the streets for a long time, so they had a lot of physical problems and weren't eating well or anything like that. So their VO2 was quite low, and then after the training it was significantly increased. So they were getting more oxygen. With each breath, they were bringing more oxygen to their body, including their brain. And then we also found a decrease in maternal distress, which is this measure of how stressed out that they felt as mothers. In fact, this woman, she was out on the streets with her boyfriend. She got pregnant. They tried to rob a Walmart. He got put in jail. She was out on the streets by herself, pregnant. Went into gave a premature delivery, and was so addicted to opiates that she left her baby in the hospital and went back out on the streets, to do drugs again. So there's a lot of trauma in this group, and luckily she was able to come to the center eventually and be reunited with her baby, and she did really well. So this program in general, it did really help. I'm not saying it was the only thing that helped. They were getting other care, obviously, at this facility, but it really did help. And I saw it on a daily basis, how much it changed their life. Because, these women didn't have memberships to gyms and things like that. So this was definitely a change for them, a big, effortful, meaningful learning experience. Okay, so the next study I want to tell you about is a study we've been doing with women and sexual violence. Like I mentioned earlier, 1 in 3 women in the world will have some type of sexual trauma or intimate partner violence. It's an everyday trauma, particularly for women that are in domestic relationships that are violent. It's also very common in college. Sadly, 20 to 40% of women have some type of sexual violence while they're in college, and a third of those survivors will actually be diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So we did a study kind of recently looking at the effects of MAP training in women who had sexual violence history. So these are women on campus who had some kind of sexual violence in the last year or so. They were all but 1 or 2 were diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And after the training, you can see there's a nearly 40% decrease in symptoms of PTSD. So doing this program twice a week for 6 weeks, we did it online, but we had someone in person doing the program with them to make sure that they did it. You can also see the rumination went down by almost a quarter. And I think probably the most impressive data was that nearly half of the women after the 6 weeks of training were no longer diagnosed with PTSD. So these are pretty dramatic changes to see in just 6 weeks for people, again, women who are suffering with a lot of symptoms. Okay, so the next study I want to tell you about has to do with chronic disease. This is a study we did with HIV. So as you know, HIV is a very difficult disease. It's treatable with drugs, but there's still a lot of problems. It is a chronic disease. You never really get rid of HIV. This was a study we did with the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program. I don't know if anyone remembers that. I do, because I was alive when HIV and AIDS first happened, and I was a young adult, and it was, scary times. It was, COVID was scary. HIV was scary too, because we didn't know where it came from, how you got it. And Ryan White was a young boy who got HIV from a blood transfusion. So he became kind of like the poster child for HIV at the time, because people thought they didn't know how you could get it. If you could get it from touching people, if you could only get it from sex, it wasn't clear at all. And so he was like this example of how you could get it, just from a blood transfusion. And then he ultimately died of it. But there's this group that keeps his memory alive by providing this HIV treatment that does help to people who can't necessarily afford it or get it. So we provided this program to women who've had HIV. So a lot of these women actually got HIV from their mothers. So they'd had it their whole lives. Because it crosses the placenta, they got it when they were pregnant, and then they had it, their whole lives. They've been taking the medications for it. So they were treated, but they still had a lot of symptoms, particularly peripheral motor symptoms. So we provided this program to them in Newark, and you can see again, pretty big effects. This was right after training. You can see a big decrease in rumination. We actually followed up 3 and 6 months later. You can see ruminations are still significantly decreased. Depression went down a lot. We always see a really big decrease in depression. And then this so-called perceived stress, the stress of everyday life, also went down and stayed down for almost 6 months. Now, I don't necessarily know if people are doing it. It's hard to know for sure. That sometimes they tell you they are, sometimes they're not. But I'm not even sure it matters so much. I feel like sometimes people just learn. They learn these skills. They might not be doing MAP training, twice a week or even ever. But maybe they're using some of these skills that they've learned. They've learned that exercise helps them when they're depressed, or they've learned that meditation helps them when they're anxious, and so they're able to take that information and use it in their everyday lives. That's my feeling, and that's really my hope. Okay, so finally I want to tell you about the study we did in the pandemic. So we had lots of plans. I'm sure everyone in this room had lots of plans when the pandemic happened, and those all went away, and we had to kind of think quickly. And so with some of my graduate students, I was like, well, this is traumatic. Maybe we should study this. What's happening? And one of my graduate students' mother was a teacher in the New York City region. And so she was like, yeah, teachers are really stressed out. This was the first summer of the pandemic, so the summer of 2020. And we still didn't have a vaccine. We didn't really know how it was transferred. We didn't know if we were going to die. I mean, I was in the hospital twice with COVID, so not being able to breathe. So I was already quite traumatized by the whole experience, even before we got into this study. And it's easy to kind of minimize it now, but it was scary times. And teachers were really afraid. They didn't know if they were going to get it, if they were going to give it to their students, if their students were going to give it to them, they were going to bring it home to their family. They didn't know if they had to go back to school in the fall. It was just really anxiety-provoking time, especially for teachers. And so we decided, that's what we're going to do. We'll go into and try to provide this program to teachers during the summer of 2020. So we provided it. This was online. One of the few things that came right out of the pandemic was this more kind of access to online type of program. So we provided this online to teachers in the New York City area. And you can see here, pretty big decrease in rumination. And then we had, waitlist control, so teachers who didn't do anything, and you could see no training, there was really no change. And again, we see this change in rumination pretty much in every study that we've done so far. We also saw a big decrease in anxiety after the training, and a decrease here in the perceived stress. But what I want to draw your attention to here is what happened in the teachers who weren't doing any training. And so you can see here, they actually got worse. So as the summer progressed, their anxiety levels got higher, and their perceived stress also got higher. So what these data suggest is not only is MAP training, this program of meditation aerobic exercise, helping people who already had trauma, but it's helping prevent the symptoms that would arise in the future, right? So it's not just about what happened to us in the past. And this is what I really want to stress is about brain training. It can't be always retrospective. We have to imagine and see things as they are and appreciate the fact that bad things are going to happen. You know, people we love are going to die, we're going to get sick, eventually we're going to die. So we have to prepare ourselves, prepare our brain for these experiences so that we won't be as affected, we won't be as anxious, we won't be as stressed out. And, you know, at least in this particular case, this program seems to help that. Okay, so the benefits of MAP training, I've showed you a few of them. Less depression, less anxiety, fewer traumatic thoughts, more oxygen in the body, which is a definite plus. More synchronized brain activity, which I'll actually talk about in a little bit. Greater self-esteem, people report greater quality of life. But the biggest thing and the most consistent thing we see are these fewer ruminations. People just say they're ruminating less, and you know, they seem to be pretty happy about that. So the question is, can we learn to ruminate? Yeah, less. And the answer is yes, we can. And as a consequence, at least theoretically, we're producing fewer and fewer of these memories. You know, by ruminating less, we're making less of these memories that are going to be with us for the rest of our lives. So it's definitely a win-win situation. Okay, so why does it work? Why does it work so well? I don't exactly know. You know, sometimes people ask me, like, well, we know meditation's good, we know exercise is good, and what's the big deal about putting them together? You know, I swim, and then I meditate later, and I'm fine. I don't know. There's just a lot of curiosity about it. Like, what is it about putting them together? So we did a study. We had some people who only meditated, some people who only exercised, and some people who did both, and others who did neither. And you know, this is a brief summary, but the people who did the MAP training ruminated, had fewer traumatic thoughts than those who just meditated alone or exercised alone. Those who did both ruminated less than those who did only meditation or exercise. And then finally, for self-worth, they had greater self-worth if they did the two together versus just doing one. Now, that's not to say meditation alone isn't good or exercise alone isn't good, but there's something about the combination that seems to be particularly effective. Now, you know, what is that? What are we learning? You know, what are people learning when they're doing this? And I think one of the things that they're learning is to dissociate what's happening in their body from what's happening in their head, in their brain. So when people are meditating, particularly if they've had a lot of trauma, you know, the mind will wander back to something bad that happened, and they might really start to think about it a lot. But typically, when people have trauma thoughts, their heart races, maybe they get anxious, they might start sweating. But in this particular case, they're meditating, calm, parasympathetic nervous system is activated. So the brain is learning, oh, just because I'm thinking about this thing that happened to me, I'm not afraid, right? It's a little bit like an exposure therapy. You're exposed to the memory, but you don't have the feeling of fear. And then vice versa, when you're exercising, your heart is racing, and a lot of times people, particularly people with trauma, when their heart races, they're afraid. Like that's a symptom of PTSD, right? That's what happens. But in this case, maybe they're even having fun. You know, in some of our programs, particularly the dance exercise one, people seem to be having a lot of fun doing it. And so again, the brain is learning, oh, just because my heart is racing, I'm sweating, I'm not afraid. And I think it can be as simple as that. You know, again, I think we look for these really complex explanations for some of these phenomena, but sometimes it's just as simple as that, like training your brain when you should be afraid and when you don't need to be afraid. Okay, what else are we learning? The other thing that I like to point out, and I hope that people are learning, particularly as you learn more and more about your own brain, is that the past does not exist. Now, I know that is so hard to accept. I have a hard time accepting, and I study memory. But, you know, I feel like, you know, in the lab, and you're looking under the microscope at, you know, where the memories are, and I get that. But then as soon as I leave the lab, I'm like back in my memory. I'm back in my, you know, my story of my life, what happened to me in the past or yesterday or whenever. And it's really hard to grasp the fact that our brain is holding the memories, period. It's good at it. It's so good at it that we believe it's real. Like I can recollect having breakfast this morning. that seems real. No, it's not real anymore. That breakfast is over. It's now just a memory trace in my brain. And I think the more that you appreciate that, the more you learn that and really drive it home in your own brain, the more free you can feel. The more free you can feel of your past. So again, it's in the brain. We don't know exactly how. I wish I did, and I could tell you that today, but we don't know exactly. It's complicated. It's just hard to figure out, but we know it's in the brain. And I think that can give people some relief from their past. Okay, so what about the brain? These studies, I translated them from some work I did many years ago now on neurogenesis. When I was in graduate school, we learned the brain doesn't make new neurons, and if you mess them up, too bad, you're not getting any more. And then in the 90s, there was a discovery, or kind of rediscovery, of these neurons that are produced even as adults. So even as you're sitting here, believe it or not, your brain is creating some new neurons. Now, the neurons are only located in specific parts of the brain, so the whole brain doesn't regenerate, not even close. It's really just in the hippocampus, maybe a few other places, olfactory bulb. I'm going to focus on the hippocampus. Here's a picture of the dentate gyrus where these cells are. You can see the bright green are the new neurons. You can see them under the microscope here. They look like little baked potatoes. And yeah, those are new neurons. And this was a big deal when these things were discovered, because everyone was like, well, wait a minute, I thought we didn't make new neurons, and now here they are. Again, they're in the hippocampus. This is the hippocampus of a human. It's a little bit harder to see in the human because it's buried down here in the temporal lobe. You can see it outlined here in blue. And a little more difficult, obviously, to detect in humans, because in order to detect it in humans, it usually has to be post-mortem. So someone would have to donate their brain and then, look for the cells. So a lot of the studies on neurogenesis were done in the rodent hippocampus, the rat or the mouse. So here's an example. The cells are like here in this region here, this dentate gyrus region. Okay, so one of the discoveries, initially we're like, well, they're in the hippocampus, these new cells, maybe they're somehow involved in learning. And so my lab, in combination with collaboration with Liz Gould's lab, we were really the first to really look at learning and memory in these cells. And one of the things that we found is that the cells are necessary for some types of learning. That's fine. That was surprising, but not unexpected. But I think the coolest finding that we had was that what we noticed is that a lot of these neurons just die. So you're generating all these neurons. Say, again, you're generating some right now, and then you look like 2-3 weeks later, most of them are dead, or at least in rats, they're dead. And so we want to know, well, what if you trained animals right when these cells are about to die? And what we found is that you can rescue these cells from death. So it's basically a use it or lose it phenomena. You're creating these cells, they're being generated, and then they die unless you use them. And through a number of studies, what we found is that there's some features of the learning that has to occur. Learning has to occur. The learning has to be new. So if you're just learning the same thing over and over again, doesn't really change the survival of these cells. And it has to be effortful, meaning the task has to be sufficiently engaging so that you really are having to work to learn. So as you can see, hopefully you remember, I was saying that about meditation, that it's always learning occurring. It's new, because every time you sit down to meditate, you're thinking about something new. You're learning something new about your life, and it's definitely effortful. So I think it satisfies these features. We also know that aerobic exercise increases neurogenesis. So this is a study done by one of my postdocs years ago. These little black cells or brownish cells are the new neurons. And after aerobic exercise, there's a big increase. So aerobic exercise makes more of these cells. And then the idea is that by training in a mental capacity, you actually keep them alive. So physical training plus the mental training that's where I came up with this idea for the MAP training. Now, that was a translation. I did this work, again, in the laboratory and then wanted to make it into this intervention of MAP training. But it's very difficult in humans to measure neurogenesis. It's actually impossible at this point other than post-mortem. But you can't really look and see like when someone's exercising or when someone's meditating, if they're making new neurons. It's just impossible at this point. You can do some kind of indirect measures. There's this one task that's called the pattern separation task. It's where people have to really distinguish between really similar objects. Have you seen this object before? Or have you seen this object but in a different orientation? It's effortful. It's a very effortful task. And in animals and in people, it's dependent on the hippocampus, and in animals, it's dependent on neurogenesis. And so we did find, a slight increase in pattern separation in people that did MAP training. Again, it's kind of indirect, but certainly it seemed to enhance their ability to make these fine distinctions. But again, it's really, you just can't. So I can't tell you today necessarily that people who are doing MAP training are making new neurons. I always think of it as the inspiration. That's what inspired me to do it. And if it turns out it's through a different mechanism, frankly, I don't care as long as it works to help people. We do know it changes the brain. We did one study looking at EEGs, and we found some pretty big increases in what's called synchronized brain activity. So you can see here the red. And that just means that after the training, more neurons are firing at the same time. And that's a good thing. You want your neurons to fire, but not just wildly, randomly. You want them to fire in synchrony, because that's how information gets transferred around the brain. So it's generally a good thing. And these are people who had been depressed, so they definitely were much better. And I have some studies ongoing now looking at some brain imaging. But one thing, I am a neuroscientist, and I love the brain, and I really can't get enough of the hippocampus. But sometimes you don't really need to look in the brain. Sometimes people just tell you. And that's one nice thing about working with humans. So some of the people that we've worked with have told me, through the years, different things about how they felt. One person told me, helps me not think so much. Another person told me, I'm now learning how to put the past in the past. And finally, I like this one a lot. This person wrote me and said, learning about neurogenesis has profoundly affected the way I live my life. I learned that the brain's anatomy can be strengthened by keeping fit. I learned that the health of my brain isn't just about my childhood, but also my choices as an adult. And this is extremely good news. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We have some questions that have been submitted online, and thank you everyone for doing that. We have a few that kind of have come together asking about the depression and anxiety being helped by meditation and exercise, and asking if there's a delineation between just using meditation or exercise, and does it matter in the order that you do them?
Yeah, probably the most common question I get is that, about the order. I did show you doing them together is better than doing just one or the other, but I don't know the answer. I purposely did the meditation first because I think it's important for people to meditate in the state that they're in. So when you sit down to meditate, if you've meditated before, you know how it is when you first sit down. You're like, oh no, what am I going to do with this, these thoughts that I have, and that's where you need to start. And I feel like if people exercise, if you exercise, like after exercise, you always feel much better. So that meditation, or even after yoga, a little meditation you do after yoga, that's pretty easy because you're already kind of in a blissful state. So I wanted people to have to work at it, to have to really focus. So that's why the meditation comes first. And then there's also some other kind of just motivational aspects, because I feel like you can get people to exercise. That's not that easy, but you can get people to exercise. But if you said, okay, now we're done exercising, now we're going to meditate, they would just leave, because people will find reasons not to meditate, myself included. I'm not even like pointing fingers, because I find all kinds of reasons not to as well. So yeah, that's why we did it.
Thank you. How would you advise someone who's grieving and they're processing a traumatic loss in their life and ruminating thoughts? So how would you advise them using MAP?
I would advise them to do it. It's just useful. We haven't specifically focused on that, but I'm sure of all the studies we've done, there's been people that have been grieving along the way. And as difficult as it is, I think it's not nearly as difficult as people think it's going to be. And it's better than doing nothing. Think about what you're doing when you're grieving. You're just sitting with the thoughts over and over and over. So I've been talking to various people today and yesterday, and I think the important thing when we think about our brain is change it up. Change it up. Because the worst thing you can do is just stay in that state. And whatever it takes. If it's MAP training, if it's, going to a movie, if it's making a new friend, if it's reading a book, and it's just change it up. Change that state, this brain state.
Thank you. And we had quite a few different questions on this, asking what the comparison is of EMDR therapy and MAP training.
Yeah, comparison. Well, we haven't done a comparison. That would be interesting. I would love to do a combination, maybe I don't know about EMDR, but maybe CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and MAP training, see if that would be like an adjunct. People have talked to me about that, but I actually don't know. I just don't know the difference.
There was a few questions too about what type of meditation. You kind of talked about, starting with meditation, but what type is recommended to use for this?
Yeah, this is
not guided.
This is non-guided, so this is completely silent. And that's what I learned to do first. I went to a Zen meditation center, which was very intense, and it was in silence. And I do feel like it's the most difficult. If you really want to learn about your own brain, listen to your own brain. And if you have someone else telling you what to think, which is kind of what happens more with guided, I know it's easier or people like it, but I'm kind of inclined to say just try it alone. It's not that bad.
Thank you. There's a question on, do you have controls for the first two studies you talked about, specifically those women living in the center?
We did have women that didn't take the class, yeah. And, they didn't change that much.
Okay. And then how do ruminations vary for someone with OCD?
That we have not looked at. Yeah. There's probably some data out there that they correlate, but yeah, OCD is, is a serious mental disorder, whereas ruminations are something all of us do. That's what the thing is. I don't want to make it sound like that's a negative thing necessarily. We all ruminate. Women ruminate a lot more than men do. The good news about aging, though, is everyone ruminates less as they get older. It's one of the good things about aging that I've ever heard.
There was a couple of comments about I'm already an active exercise participant, and so a high percentage of people still experience trauma, and we see the benefits of exercise. Does this MAP training help someone who's already a consistent exercise participant?
If they add in the meditation, you mean? Yes, I definitely think it would. Again, I think it's more, to think of it as like a lifestyle. I think that's the important thing. How can you get some of these activities into your everyday life? And, sometimes people ask me well, do I have to do it every day? No, because you won't do it every day. So do it once a week, maybe twice a week. That's okay. We don't all have to be, Zen monks or, Olympic athletes. We could just do 1 hour and it'll help you. Yeah. But make it a habit.
And then there was a question about what are the antibodies you use to detect the neurogenesis?
Oh my gosh. Well, NextGen, DCX, I don't even remember all of them actually, to be honest. And I'm sure there's a whole new slew of them since I did that work. But that was one of the controversies, I should say, about humans. Like, at the time when neurogenesis was first discovered, some of the markers for neurons weren't well developed. And so that was why there was, lots of controversy, particularly in humans, because the tissue's, just not available. But I think we can be pretty sure that we're making new neurons.
So for the last question, there was a kind of a continuing of another idea of the OCD, but is there associations between rumination and neurological diseases like dementia or myasthenia gravis?
That I don't know. The most of the work on ruminations has been with depression, but that would be interesting to know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't really think anyone's looked, but I might be wrong. Yeah.
I have a more difficult question. So as a nerve and muscle disease specialist, many of my patients are weak. They can't get their heart rate above 60%. So do you think that could drive some of the consequences of the disease? And do you have options or ideas on how we could create a MAP program that might be functional for them? That's a tough question.
That's a tough question. So they can't get their heart rate up, or they...
Muscles are basically paralyzed. And so they are not as able to do physical exercise to achieve that heart rate. So that, as you were thinking, I was thinking about, we do have some ways, like there's an investigator in the building that's working on a new type of exercise that uses electrical stimulation to activate the muscles, even though patients can't. So we're trying to do that. No, we're not adding in meditation. Maybe we should.
Yeah.
So I would just like to thank you for presenting your work. So NextGen Precision Health is about generating the next generation of therapies and health, and what you're doing is impacting people, and we would like to share this token of our appreciation.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
This was fabricated by
thank you.
somebody in the building actually crafts this.
Oh, I love it.
From lumber within just a few miles.
Wow, it's beautiful.
Thank you for coming to Columbia. I understand this is your first time. You came to St. Louis in the past for SFN.
I have.
So welcome back. And I want to invite everybody on August 14th. We have Dr. Michael Nichols. We're going to be in St. Louis at UMSL. So we'll live cast it here. So you can join for food and to observe on the screen and ask questions. So please join us. Thank you.
Thank you all.